I was halfway through my morning coffee when I heard the knock on my front door, the kind of aggressive rapping that made it clear someone was not in a pleasant mood. Opening it revealed a sight that would have been amusing if I wasn't still groggy from sleep. A woman in her late 40s with a severe blonde bob haircut, wearing pearls at 9 in the morning, holding a clipboard like it was a weapon. "Are you Henry Dalton?" she demanded, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. "That's me," I replied, taking another sip of coffee. "And you are Patricia Morrison, president of the Willow Creek HOA board," she announced, as if I should be impressed. "I'm here to inform you that you've been reported for multiple violations, and there will be a formal hearing before the board next Tuesday at 7 in the evening. Your presence is mandatory." I blinked at her, trying to process what she was saying. "Violations? What violations?" She consulted her clipboard with theatrical precision. "Unauthorized vehicle parked in your driveway for more than 48 hours, failure to maintain lawn height within regulation standards, and displaying decorative items not approved by the Architectural Review Committee." "My truck has been in my driveway because that's where I park it," I said slowly. "The lawn was mowed 3 days ago, and what decorative items?" "The garden gnome," Patricia said, her lips pursing like she had tasted something sour. Section 12. Paragraph 4 of the HOA bylaws clearly states that all exterior decorations must receive written approval before installation. I glanced back at the small concrete gnome my late mother had given me years ago, sitting harmlessly beside my front steps. "That's been there for 2 years. "Then you've been in violation for 2 years, Patricia said crisply. "The fines will be calculated accordingly. $500 per violation per month. You'll receive the full invoice before the hearing." My brain was starting to wake up now, and something tickled at the back of my mind. Something important. "Patricia Morrison, you said?" "Yes, and I expect to see you Tuesday evening. The address is in the notice." She thrust a manila envelope at me. "Good day, Mr. Dalton." She turned on her heel and marched back down my walkway, climbing into a white Lexus SUV that probably cost more than most people made in a year. I watched her drive away, then looked down at the envelope in my hand. Inside was a formal letter outlining exactly what she had told me, along with a copy of the relevant HOA bylaws. As I read through them, I felt a slow smile spreading across my face, because now I remembered exactly where I had heard Patricia Morrison's name before. 3 years ago, I had inherited a significant portfolio of properties from my uncle, including several investment properties in the suburbs of Phoenix, Arizona. Among them was an entire complex of townhomes in a development called Willow Creek. The development had an HOA, of course, managed by a property management company called Prestige Community Services. As the owner of the property, I was technically the landlord of everyone who rented in that complex, but I had kept a low profile, letting the management company handle day-to-day operations. What Patricia Morrison didn't know, what she couldn't know because the property ownership was held under an LLC, was that she was currently living in one of my townhomes. In fact, based on the address I had on file, she lived at 2847 Maple Ridge Drive, Unit B, in Willow Creek. She had been renting from me for the past 2 years, and now I really started to remember things clearly. I walked back inside and opened my laptop, pulling up the property management portal. It took me a few minutes to navigate to the right section, but there it was, Patricia Morrison's rental history. She had been late on rent 4 times in the past 18 months. Each time, the property management company had sent notices, and each time, she had paid just before the late fee deadline, sending angry emails about how the payment portal was difficult to use or how she had forgotten because she was so busy with community obligations. There was more. I scrolled through the maintenance requests. She had called in complaints about her neighbors at least 15 times. Noise complaints, parking complaints, complaints about someone's dog barking. The property manager had investigated each one and found most of them to be either exaggerated or completely unfounded. But what really caught my attention was a note from 6 months ago. Patricia had demanded that the property manager evict the tenant in the unit next to hers because they had installed a decorative flag holder on their front porch. The property manager had politely informed her that decorative flag holders were not against any rules and that she had no authority to demand such action. Patricia had responded with a 3-page email about maintaining property values and community standards. I sat back in my chair, coffee forgotten. This was going to be interesting. Over the next few days, I did my homework. I pulled every file I had on Willow Creek, every communication, every complaint, every board meeting minute that had been forwarded to me as the property owner. The HOA board consisted of 5 members. Patricia Morrison as president, a man named Gerald Finch as vice president, a woman named Susan Chen as treasurer, and 2 other members whose names I barely recognized because they apparently never said or did anything at meetings. Patricia, however, was a force of nature. She dominated every meeting, pushing through rules and regulations that seemed designed more to annoy people than to actually maintain property values. In the past year alone, she had successfully passed restrictions on the color of mailboxes, the type of outdoor lighting allowed, the specific shade of beige that front doors could be painted, and a rule requiring all residents to remove their trash cans from view within 2 hours of collection. The more I read, the more I realized that Patricia Morrison had turned the Willow Creek HOA into her personal fiefdom, and she had no idea that the person she was now targeting was actually her landlord. Tuesday evening arrived. I dressed in a button-down shirt and khakis, nothing too formal but presentable enough for an HOA hearing. I drove to the community center where the meeting was being held, a bland beige building that matched the bland beige aesthetic that Patricia seemed to love so much. The meeting room was set up like a courtroom, with a long table at the front for the board members and rows of chairs facing them. About 20 residents were scattered throughout the room, some looking bored, others nervous. I recognized a few faces from the property management files. Patricia sat in the center of the board table, flanked by her fellow board members. She spotted me as I walked in and gave me a tight-lipped smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Mr. Dalton," she said as I took a seat in the front row. "How punctual. We'll get to your case shortly." The meeting started with the usual bureaucratic nonsense. Reading of previous minutes, treasurer's report, discussion of upcoming maintenance projects. I half listened, watching Patricia hold court. She interrupted people constantly, dismissed concerns with a wave of her hand, and generally acted like she was running a dictatorship rather than a homeowners association. Finally, after 45 minutes of tedium, Patricia cleared her throat. "Now we come to the violation hearings." First case, Henry Dalton of 1523 Cedar Lane. I stood up and walked to the small podium that had been set up for residents to address the board. "Mr. Dalton," Patricia began, reading from her notes, "you've been cited for 3 violations. First, maintaining an unauthorized vehicle in your driveway for extended periods. Second, failure to maintain lawn height within regulation. Third, displaying unapproved decorative items. How do you plead?" "How do I plead?" I repeated. "This isn't a criminal trial." A few scattered chuckles came from the audience. Patricia's expression hardened. How do you respond to these charges? She corrected herself icily. I'd like to see the specific bylaws you're citing, I said, with the exact dates they were enacted. Patricia looked momentarily thrown off but recovered quickly. She shuffled through her papers and read off several section numbers. I pulled out my phone and opened the documents I had downloaded. Section 12, Paragraph 4, I read aloud. All exterior decorations must receive written approval before installation. This section was added to the bylaws on March 15th, 2 years ago. My garden gnome was installed 4 years ago. So unless you're arguing that rules apply retroactively, which would be legally questionable, there's no violation. Patricia's face flushed slightly. The rule applies to all decorations currently on display. Show me where it says that, I challenged. Show me the specific language that makes this rule retroactive. She couldn't because it wasn't there. Gerald Finch, the vice president, leaned over and whispered something to her. She listened, her expression growing more sour by the second. Fine, she snapped. We'll table the decoration violation for now. What about the vehicle and the lawn? My truck is registered to my address and is parked in my designated driveway, I said. I've reviewed the bylaws, and there's no restriction on how long a resident's own vehicle can be parked in their own driveway. The restriction you're citing applies to non-resident vehicles and visitors. The spirit of the rule, Patricia started. The letter of the law is what matters, I interrupted. You can't enforce rules based on what you think the spirit should be. As for the lawn, I have time-stamped photos from my security camera showing that my lawn was mowed 72 hours before you cited me. The grass is Bermuda grass, which grows quickly in Phoenix heat, but it was within the 3-inch height limit specified in the bylaws at the time of your citation. I pulled up the photos on my phone and held it up. Patricia didn't even look at them. This board has the authority to interpret the bylaws as we see fit, she said coldly. Actually, you don't, I replied, keeping my voice calm. The bylaws are a legally binding contract. Arbitrary interpretation isn't allowed under Arizona HOA law. If you want to change the rules, you need to follow the proper amendment process, which requires resident notification and voting. The room had gone very quiet. I could feel everyone's eyes on us. Patricia looked like she wanted to reach across the table and strangle me. Are you a lawyer, Mr. Dalton? She asked with forced sweetness. No, but I've read the bylaws thoroughly, which is apparently more than the board has done. That got some actual laughs from the audience. Susan Chen, the treasurer, was trying to hide a smile. Gerald Finch looked uncomfortable. Patricia slammed her gavel down. This hearing is concluded. The board will review the evidence and issue a ruling within 10 business days. I look forward to it, I said pleasantly, returning to my seat. The meeting continued with other business, but the energy had shifted. People were whispering to each other, and I caught more than one approving glance in my direction. Patricia powered through the rest of the agenda with barely controlled fury, and when she finally adjourned the meeting, she practically fled from the room. I was gathering my things when a man in his 60s approached me. That was well done, he said, extending his hand. Thomas Wright. I live over on Elm Street. I shook his hand. Henry Dalton. I know, Thomas said with a slight grin. You just became a legend. Patricia has been making everyone's lives miserable for 2 years. Nobody's ever stood up to her like that. She seems to enjoy the power, I observed. That's putting it mildly, Thomas said. Last year, she tried to fine me because my house number wasn't the exact approved font. The exact approved font. I had to repaint my numbers 3 times before she was satisfied. A woman joined us, looking to be in her early 40s with tired eyes. I'm Jennifer Lucas, she said. I just wanted to say thank you. Patricia cited me last month because my daughter drew a hopscotch court on our driveway with sidewalk chalk. Sidewalk chalk. She called it graffiti and tried to fine us $200. More people came over, each with their own story of Patricia's petty tyranny. A young couple who had been fined for having the wrong shade of curtains visible from the street. An elderly man who had been cited for using a walking cane that didn't match the aesthetic standards of the community, because it was bright red instead of a neutral color. A single mother who had been harassed for weeks because her work schedule meant she sometimes didn't bring her trash cans in within the 2-hour window. By the time I left the community center, I had a much clearer picture of what was happening in Willow Creek. Patricia Morrison had systematically used the HOA as a weapon to bully and control her neighbors. And from what I was hearing, she had also been using her position to benefit herself in various small ways, like having HOA funds pay for landscaping improvements to her specific unit, while other areas went neglected. That last part was particularly interesting, because if true, it might constitute a breach of her fiduciary duty as an HOA board member. And it definitely constituted a violation of her lease agreement with me, which specifically prohibited using the rental property for any kind of fraudulent activity. I spent the next week digging deeper. I contacted the property management company and requested a full audit of HOA expenditures for the past 2 years. I also reached out to my lawyer, a sharp woman named Rachel Martinez, who specialized in property law and HOA disputes. "This is a mess," Rachel said after reviewing the documents I sent her. "She's been approving expenditures that directly benefit her unit while denying similar requests from other residents. That's textbook self-dealing, and some of these fines she's been levying. They're not even authorized under the bylaws. She's just making them up." "Can we do anything about it?" I asked. "Oh, we can do a lot," Rachel said, and I could hear the smile in her voice. "As the property owner, you have standing to challenge HOA decisions that affect your properties. And as her landlord, you have grounds to review whether she's violated her lease terms. But here's the really interesting part. If she's been collecting fines that aren't authorized by the bylaws, that might constitute theft or fraud, depending on how the money was handled. So we could potentially involve law enforcement. Let's not get ahead of ourselves," Rachel cautioned. "First, we need to build a solid case. Get me every financial record you can from the HOA. I want to see exactly where the money has been going." The audit took another week, but the results were damning. Over the past 2 years, Patricia had approved over $30,000 in improvements to common areas immediately adjacent to her unit, including new landscaping, a decorative fountain, and upgraded lighting. Meanwhile, similar requests from other areas of the complex had been denied or delayed indefinitely. She had also been collecting fines at rates that didn't match the bylaws. The bylaws specified maximum fine amounts, but Patricia had been charging whatever she felt like, sometimes double or triple the allowed amount. And in several cases, she had collected fines for violations that weren't actually violations at all, just things she personally didn't like. The money from these improper fines had gone into the HOA General Fund, which Patricia controlled as board president. From there, it had been used to fund her pet projects, creating a nice circular system of abuse. "This is fraud," Rachel said flatly when she saw the numbers. "Clear-cut fraud." She's been using her position to essentially steal from the residents. "What's our next move?" I asked. "We're going to request a special meeting of the HOA," Rachel said. "As a property owner with multiple units in the complex, you have the right to call for one. We're going to lay all of this out in front of the entire community and demand Patricia's resignation. If she refuses, We'll pursue legal action." The letter went out the next day, formally requesting a special meeting to address concerns about board conduct and financial management. Under Arizona HOA law, the board was required to schedule the meeting within 30 days. Patricia's response came within hours. She called me directly, her voice shaking with rage. "What do you think you're doing?" she demanded. "Exercising my rights as a property owner," I said calmly. "I have concerns about how the HOA is being managed. You don't own property here, you rent." "Actually, I own several properties in Willow Creek," I said, "including the one you live in." There was a long, beautiful silence on the other end of the line. "What?" Patricia finally said, her voice barely a whisper. "I own 2847 Maple Ridge Drive, Unit B," I said, "along with 15 other units in this complex. The properties are held under an LLC, which is why you didn't make the connection. But yes, Patricia, I'm your landlord. And I remember everything very clearly, including the 4 times you've been late on rent and the numerous frivolous complaints you've filed against your neighbors." "You're lying," she said, but there was no conviction in her voice. "Check your lease agreement," I suggested. "The landlord is listed as Dalton Properties LLC. That's me. And right now, I'm reviewing whether your conduct as HOA president constitutes a lease violation." She hung up on me. I wasn't surprised. The special meeting was scheduled for 3 weeks later, giving Rachel and me plenty of time to prepare. We compiled every piece of evidence we had: the financial records, the improperly levied fines, the self-dealing expenditures, the testimony from residents who had been harassed. We built a comprehensive case that would be impossible to deny. But Patricia wasn't going down without a fight. In the days leading up to the meeting, she went on a citation spree, issuing violations to anyone she suspected of supporting me. Thomas Wright got cited for having a wreath on his door that was allegedly the wrong size. Jennifer Lucas got cited for parking violations, even though her car was properly parked in her assigned spot. The young couple with the curtain issue got cited again, this time for having a door mat that was the wrong color. It was petty, vindictive, and exactly what I expected. But it also played right into our hands, because every bogus citation was more evidence of abuse of power. The night of the special meeting arrived. The community center was packed, with nearly 100 residents crammed into a space designed for 50. People were standing along the walls, sitting on the floor, pressed together in the doorway. Word had spread about what was happening, and everyone wanted to see it. Patricia sat at the board table, flanked by Gerald and Susan. The other 2 board members were notably absent. Patricia looked composed, but I could see the tension in her shoulders, the way her hands gripped her papers just a little too tightly. I stood at the podium with Rachel beside me. The room buzzed with conversation until Patricia banged her gavel. "This special meeting will come to order," she announced. "Mr. Dalton has requested this meeting to address concerns about board operations. Mr. Dalton, you have the floor." Rachel stepped forward. "Good evening, everyone. My name is Rachel Martinez, and I'm representing Mr. Dalton and several other property owners in this matter. We're here tonight because evidence has come to light that suggests serious financial mismanagement and abuse of authority by the current HOA board, specifically by President Patricia Morrison." The room went dead silent. Rachel continued, her voice clear and professional. "Over the past 2 years, Mrs. Morrison has approved over $30,000 in expenditures that directly benefited her personal residence while denying similar requests from other residents. She has levied fines in amounts that exceed what is authorized by the HOA bylaws. She has issued citations for violations that don't actually exist under the governing documents, and she has used her position to harass and intimidate residents who question her authority. She began distributing packets to the audience, thick documents containing all of our evidence. In these packets, you'll find detailed financial records, copies of improperly issued citations, and testimony from numerous residents about their experiences with the current board. We believe this evidence demonstrates a clear pattern of misconduct that requires immediate action. Patricia stood up abruptly. This is outrageous. These accusations are completely unfounded and this meeting is inappropriate. I move to adjourn. You can't adjourn a special meeting you didn't call, Rachel said coolly. Mr. Dalton, as a property owner, has the right to hold this forum. You need to sit down and address these allegations. I don't need to do anything. Patricia's voice was rising, her composure cracking. I have served this community faithfully for 2 years and I won't be subjected to this kind of attack, Mrs. Morrison, Rachel said, her tone hardening. Are you denying that you approved $30,000 in improvements to areas immediately adjacent to your rental unit? Those were community improvements. Are you denying that you've issued fines in excess of the amount specified in the bylaws? The board has discretion to set appropriate penalties. Are you denying that you cited Mr. Thomas Wright for having a wreath that violated no actual regulation? Patricia's face was turning red. That wreath was garish and inappropriate, but it violated no regulation, Rachel pressed. Yes or no, Mrs. Morrison? Did Thomas Wright's wreath violate any specific provision of the HOA bylaws? Patricia opened her mouth, then closed it. Around the room, people were flipping through the packets Rachel had distributed, their expressions ranging from shock to furious as they read the evidence. I think we have our answer, Rachel said. She turned to address the full room. Ladies and gentlemen, what we have here is a board president who has systematically abused her authority for personal benefit. She has used HOA funds as her personal piggy bank. She has harassed residents who don't meet her arbitrary standards. And she has violated the very bylaws she was elected to uphold. Susan Chen, the treasurer, stood up slowly. She looked pale. I need to say something, she said quietly. Patricia whirled on her. Susan, sit down. No, Susan said, her voice getting stronger. I'm not sitting down. I'm not doing this anymore. She turned to face the crowd. Everything in these documents is true. I've watched Patricia do all of this, and I said nothing because I was afraid she would turn on me. But I'm the treasurer. I signed off on these expenditures because Patricia told me to. I'm complicit in this, and I'm sorry. The room erupted. People started shouting questions, demanding answers. Patricia tried to regain control, banging her gavel frantically, but nobody was listening to her anymore. Gerald Finch stood up and quietly walked out of the room. Smart man. Rachel waited for the noise to die down, then spoke again. We are calling for the immediate resignation of Patricia Morrison as HOA board president. Additionally, we are recommending a full forensic audit of HOA finances and a review of all citations and fines issued in the past 2 years. Any fines found to be improperly levied should be refunded to the residents. I will not resign, Patricia said defiantly. You can't force me out. Actually, we can, Rachel said. Under the HOA bylaws, a special election can be called to remove board members for cause. And I'd say we have plenty of cause, but that's not the only issue here, Mrs. Morrison. Rachel paused for effect. Are you aware that financial fraud in HOA management can constitute criminal theft under Arizona law? Patricia went very still. What? You've collected fines that weren't authorized by the bylaws and used HOA funds for personal benefit, Rachel explained. That's not just a civil matter. It's potentially criminal. Now, we haven't contacted law enforcement yet because we're hoping this can be resolved without going that far. But if you refuse to cooperate, if you continue to abuse your position, we will have no choice but to file a complaint with the Phoenix Police Department." Patricia sank back into her chair, all the fight draining out of her. Around the room, residents were murmuring to each other, some angry, some satisfied, all shocked by what they were hearing. Thomas Wright stood up. "I move that we hold an immediate vote of no confidence in Patricia Morrison and remove her as board president." "I second that," Jennifer Lucas called out. The vote was overwhelming. Out of nearly 100 residents present, only 3 voted to keep Patricia in place, and I suspected those 3 had either not been paying attention or were her personal friends. The rest voted to remove her immediately. Patricia sat in stunned silence as the votes were counted. When the final tally was announced, she slowly gathered her papers, stood up, and walked out of the room without a word. The community center erupted in applause, but we weren't done yet. Over the next week, Rachel filed a formal complaint with Prestige Community Services, detailing Patricia's lease violations. Using HOA funds for personal benefit and engaging in fraudulent activity were clear breaches of the rental agreement. I had grounds to terminate her lease and begin eviction proceedings. We also filed a demand for full restitution of the improperly collected fines. The forensic audit revealed that Patricia had collected over $47,000 in bogus fines over 2 years. Every single one of those fines needed to be refunded. Patricia hired a lawyer, of course. He tried to argue that she had been acting in good faith, that the financial decisions were made by the full board, that the fines were reasonable interpretations of the bylaws. But the evidence was too strong. Rachel demolished every argument with precision. The settlement came 2 months later. Patricia agreed to pay back all of the improperly collected fines, to resign permanently from any HOA position, and to vacate her rental unit within 60 days. In exchange, we agreed not to pursue criminal charges. She moved out on a rainy Tuesday in March. I happened to be driving past the complex that day and saw the moving truck outside her unit. Patricia was directing the movers with the same imperious attitude she had brought to everything else, but there was a defeated slump to her shoulders that hadn't been there before. Part of me felt bad for her. She had clearly gotten caught up in the small amount of power she had been given and let it corrupt her judgment. But then I thought about Thomas Wright being harassed over a wreath, about Jennifer Lucas being cited for her daughter's sidewalk chalk, about all the people who had been bullied and intimidated by someone who was supposed to be serving the community. No, I didn't feel that bad. The HOA held new elections. A retired school teacher named Margaret Reeves was elected as the new president, running on a platform of transparency and common sense. One of her first acts was to repeal about half of the ridiculous rules Patricia had pushed through, including the trash can time limit, the mailbox color restriction, and the curtain visibility rule. Life in Willow Creek improved dramatically. People started talking to their neighbors again, hosting barbecues, organizing community events. The atmosphere went from tense and suspicious to actually pleasant. It was amazing what removing one toxic person could do for an entire community. As for me, I kept a lower profile but stayed involved. I attended HOA meetings occasionally, more as an observer than a participant. Margaret ran things efficiently and fairly, and the new board actually listened to resident concerns instead of dismissing them. 3 months after Patricia moved out, I rented her former unit to a lovely retired couple from Minnesota who were thrilled to find such a quiet, friendly community. They told me that their previous HOA had been a nightmare, with a board president who made everyone's lives miserable. I just smiled and told them they would find Willow Creek much more pleasant. I never told them the full story. It wasn't necessary. The past was the past, and the community had moved on. But I kept all the documentation, every piece of evidence, every record of what had happened. Not because I expected to need it again, but because I wanted to remember. I wanted to remember how a little bit of power in the wrong hands could cause so much damage. I wanted to remember how important it was to stand up to bullies, even when they had authority on their side. And I wanted to remember that sometimes justice actually does prevail if you're patient and thorough and willing to fight for what's right. The garden gnome still sits beside my front steps, where it's been for 4 years now. Nobody has complained about it since that first citation from Patricia. In fact, several of my neighbors have added their own lawn decorations. A ceramic frog here, a stone turtle there, even a small pink flamingo that would have sent Patricia into apoplexy. Every time I see those decorations, I smile. They're not just whimsical additions to people's yards. They're small acts of rebellion, tiny declarations of independence from the tyranny that once ruled Willow Creek. And that's worth more than any perfectly maintained, rigidly controlled, utterly soulless community standard could ever be. One afternoon in late April, about 4 months after the whole situation had resolved, I was working in my home office when my phone rang. It was Rachel Martinez. "Henry, I thought you should know," she said. "Patricia Morrison is in trouble again." "What happened?" I asked, curious despite myself. "She moved to a different community after leaving Willow Creek," Rachel explained. "Apparently, she managed to get herself elected to that HOA board too, but someone there did their homework and found out about what happened here. They contacted me asking for information." "Did you tell them?" "I gave them the basic facts," Rachel said. "They're now in the process of removing her from their board before she can cause the same kind of damage she did at Willow Creek." I shook my head in amazement. "She never learned her lesson." "Some people never do," Rachel said. "They're so convinced they're right, so sure they know better than everyone else, that they can't see the damage they cause. Patricia Morrison is one of those people. She'll probably keep trying to insert herself into positions of power until the day she dies, never understanding why people keep rejecting her." After hanging up, I sat at my desk for a while, thinking about Patricia. In a way, I almost pitied her. She was so desperate for control, so hungry for the respect and authority she felt she deserved, that she had destroyed every opportunity she was given. She could have been a good HOA president if she had focused on actually serving the community instead of ruling over it. She could have been a respected member of any neighborhood if she had treated her neighbors with basic decency instead of contempt, but she hadn't. And now her name was essentially blacklisted in HOA circles throughout Phoenix. No community would trust her with authority again. The lesson, I supposed, was that reputation mattered. The way you treated people mattered. And eventually, karma had a way of catching up with you. Life continued in Willow Creek. Summer arrived, bringing the brutal Phoenix heat that could melt asphalt and make breathing feel like inhaling from an oven. But even the heat couldn't dampen the improved spirit of the community. Margaret Reeves organized a summer social at the community center, complete with ice cream and fans, and a general celebration of making it through another scorching Arizona June. I attended, partly out of obligation as a property owner and partly out of genuine curiosity. The turnout was impressive, with families and couples and retirees all mingling together, sharing stories and laughter. Thomas Wright found me by the punch bowl. "Henry, good to see you. How are the properties treating you?" "No complaints," I said. "Well, except for a broken air conditioner last week, but that's normal wear and tear." Better a broken air conditioner than a broken HOA board, Thomas said with a grin. He raised his cup in a mock toast. Here's to standing up to tyrants, no matter how small their kingdom. I clinked my cup against his. I'll drink to that. Jennifer Lucas joined us with her daughter, a bright-eyed 8-year-old named Emma. Mr. Dalton, Emma wanted to show you something. Emma held up a piece of paper with a crayon drawing of a garden gnome. This is for you, she said shyly. Mommy told me you saved everyone from the mean lady. I took the drawing, genuinely touched. Thank you, Emma. This is wonderful. I'll put it on my refrigerator. She's been drawing gnomes all week, Jennifer said with a laugh. Ever since I told her the story. You've become something of a hero in our house. I'm not a hero, I protested. I just stood up for myself. Anyone could have done it. But most people don't, Thomas pointed out. Most people just keep their heads down and accept whatever abuse gets thrown at them because fighting back seems too hard, too risky. You fought back and you won. That matters to people. As the party continued, more residents came over to thank me, to share their stories of how much better life had been since Patricia left. A young man named David told me about how he could finally fly his college football team flag without fear of citation. An elderly woman named Ruth told me she had been able to plant roses in her front yard, something Patricia had forbidden because they weren't on the approved plant list. A middle-aged couple told me they had been seriously considering moving before the HOA situation was resolved, but now they loved living in Willow Creek. It was humbling, honestly. I hadn't set out to become some kind of community champion. I had just been defending my own property rights and standing up to a bully. But apparently, that was enough to make a real difference in people's lives. Margaret Reeves found me as the party was winding down. Henry, I wanted to thank you personally, she said. Not just for what you did with Patricia, but for trusting the community to elect a new board. You could have tried to take control yourself, given how many properties you own here, but you let us choose our own leadership. That means a lot. I'm not interested in running an HOA, I said honestly. I just wanted things to be fair and reasonable. You're doing a great job, Margaret. The community is lucky to have you. She smiled, her face crinkling with warmth. I'm trying. It's not always easy, but I remember what it was like under Patricia, and that motivates me to do better. Every time I'm tempted to make some arbitrary rule just because I personally don't like something, I think about her, and I stop myself. That's all any of us can do, I said. Remember the bad examples and try not to repeat them. As I drove home that evening, windows down to catch the slightly cooler night air, I reflected on how much had changed in just a few months. Willow Creek had gone from a tense, miserable place ruled by fear and petty regulations to a genuine community where people actually wanted to live. And all it had taken was removing one toxic person and replacing her with someone who actually cared about serving rather than controlling. But I also thought about the broader implications. How many HOAs across the country were dealing with their own versions of Patricia Morrison? How many communities were suffering under petty tyrants who had gotten a taste of power and let it corrupt them? How many people were being fined, harassed, and bullied simply because they had the misfortune to live in a neighborhood with an abusive HOA board? The problem, I realized, was accountability. HOAs were supposed to be democratic, with boards elected by and answerable to the residents. But in practice, most people didn't pay attention to HOA elections or meetings until it was too late. They let small groups of busybodies take control, and by the time the abuse became obvious, those people were entrenched in power and difficult to remove. The solution was vigilance. Residents needed to stay involved, to pay attention, to speak up when things went wrong. And when someone like Patricia Morrison emerged, showing clear signs of abusing their authority, the community needed to act quickly to remove them before the damage became extensive. I had been lucky. I had the resources, the knowledge, and the legal standing to challenge Patricia effectively. But what about people who didn't have those advantages? What about renters who feared retaliation, or homeowners who couldn't afford lawyers, or elderly residents who were simply too tired to fight? That question bothered me for weeks. I kept thinking about all the stories I had heard from Willow Creek residents, all the people who had suffered in silence because they didn't think they had any recourse. I thought about the communities that were still suffering under abusive HOA boards, where no Henry Dalton had shown up to challenge the status quo. Finally, I called Rachel Martinez. "I want to do something," I told her. "Something to help other people in situations like what happened at Willow Creek." "What did you have in mind?" Rachel asked. "I'm not sure yet," I admitted. "Maybe a resource website, information about HOA rights, how to challenge improper fines, how to recall abusive board members." "I have the documentation from the Willow Creek case. Maybe that could serve as a template for other people dealing with similar situations." Rachel was quiet for a moment. "That's actually a really good idea," she said finally. "I've represented dozens of clients in HOA disputes over the years, and the biggest problem is always that people don't know their rights. They assume the HOA board has unlimited authority and that there's nothing they can do to fight back. A clear, accessible resource explaining the law and providing concrete examples would be incredibly valuable." "Would you be willing to help?" I asked. "I can handle the website and documentation, but I'd need a lawyer to verify that all the legal information is accurate." "I'd be happy to," Rachel said. "In fact, I have several colleagues who specialize in HOA law who might want to contribute too. We could make this a really comprehensive resource." Over the next 3 months, we built the website. I documented everything that had happened at Willow Creek, from Patricia's initial citation to the final settlement. I explained each step of the process, what legal principles applied, what mistakes I had made, and what had worked well. Rachel wrote detailed explanations of Arizona HOA law, covering topics like proper fine procedures, board election rules, financial transparency requirements, and resident rights. Her colleagues contributed articles about HOA law in other states, expanding the resource beyond just Arizona. We included template letters for requesting documents, challenging fines, and calling special meetings. We created a section on when to involve lawyers versus when residents could handle things themselves. We even included a forum where people could share their own HOA stories and get advice from others who had been through similar situations. We called it HOA Accountability, and we launched it in September. I didn't expect much initial traffic, maybe a few dozen visitors from people I told about it directly. Within a week, we had over 10,000 unique visitors. Within a month, that number had grown to over 100,000. Apparently, we had tapped into a massive unmet need. People across the country were dealing with abusive HOAs, and they were desperate for information about their rights and options. The stories that came through the forum were both heartbreaking and infuriating. A veteran in Florida who was being fined for displaying an American flag, despite federal law protecting that right. A disabled woman in Texas whose HOA was demanding she remove the ramp that allowed her to access her own home. A family in Nevada being harassed because their teenage son had painted a mural on his bedroom window that was visible from the street. But there were also success stories. People who had used the information on our website to successfully challenge improper fines. communities that had recalled abusive board members and elected new leadership, HOAs that had reformed their bylaws to be more reasonable after residents organized and demanded change. Each success story felt like a small victory against the petty tyranny that had infected so many HOAs. And each one reminded me why I had started this project in the first place. Life in Willow Creek continued to improve. Margaret Reeves proved to be an excellent president, balancing the need for reasonable rules with respect for individual autonomy. The community held regular social events, the kind of things that actually brought neighbors together rather than driving them apart. Property values increased not because of rigid aesthetic standards, but because people genuinely wanted to live there. I rented out Patricia's former unit twice more over the next year, as the Minnesota couple eventually moved to be closer to their grandchildren. Both times, I made sure to thoroughly explain to the new tenants what kind of community Willow Creek was, emphasizing the importance of respecting neighbors and following reasonable rules. I never told them the full Patricia story unless they specifically asked about HOA history, but I made it clear that the community had been through some changes and was better for it. On the one-year anniversary of Patricia's removal from the board, Thomas Wright organized an informal gathering at his place. He invited everyone who had been involved in the challenge against Patricia, about 15 people in total. We sat around his backyard, drinking beer and lemonade depending on preference, sharing stories and laughing about the whole ridiculous situation. To Henry, Thomas said, raising his bottle, for reminding us that we don't have to accept tyranny, even in a homeowners association. To Henry, everyone echoed. I felt my face getting warm. I appreciate it, but I didn't do this alone. Rachel did most of the legal heavy lifting. Susan Chen showed courage by speaking up when it mattered. All of you supported the vote to remove Patricia. It was a group effort. Maybe, Jennifer Lucas said, but you started it. You were the first person to stand up to her, and that gave the rest of us permission to do the same. Sometimes that's all people need, someone to take the first step and show them it's possible. I thought about that later, after the party had ended and I was back in my own home with my coffee and my garden gnome. Jennifer was right, in a way. The hardest part of standing up to any bully, whether it's a schoolyard tough or an HOA president drunk on power, is taking that first step. Once someone demonstrates that the bully can be challenged, that their authority isn't absolute, others find the courage to join in. I had been in a unique position to challenge Patricia effectively, because I was her landlord and a significant property owner in the community. But the principle applied to everyone. Anyone could have started the challenge. Anyone could have been the one to say, enough is enough, and demand accountability. The key was remembering that HOA boards, despite sometimes acting like they have unlimited power, are ultimately answerable to the residents. They're elected positions, not dictatorships. And when boards abuse their authority, residents have legal remedies available to them. That was the message of the HOA accountability website, and it was the lesson I had learned from the whole Willow Creek experience. Power, even in something as seemingly trivial as a homeowners association, needs to be checked. Authority needs to be questioned. And people in positions of leadership need to be held accountable for their actions. 2 years after the Patricia Morrison situation was resolved, I received an unexpected letter. It was from Patricia herself, forwarded through Rachel Martinez's office. Rachel had included a note saying she had vetted the letter to make sure it contained nothing threatening or inappropriate, but she thought I might want to see it. The letter was surprisingly brief and almost humble in tone. Patricia wrote that she had spent the past 2 years in therapy. working through what she described as control issues that had caused her to abuse her authority as HOA president. She acknowledged that she had been wrong, that she had hurt people, and that she deserved the consequences she had faced. She didn't ask for forgiveness or try to excuse her behavior. She simply wanted me to know that she understood what she had done and was trying to become a better person. I read the letter 3 times, trying to decide how I felt about it. Part of me was skeptical. People who behaved the way Patricia had behaved rarely changed fundamentally. Part of me wondered if this was just another manipulation, an attempt to rehabilitate her image. But another part of me, the part that wanted to believe people could grow and change, appreciated the gesture. Even if Patricia never truly understood the full impact of her actions, even if she backslid into old patterns in the future, at least she had taken this moment to acknowledge her mistakes. I wrote back a short reply. I thanked her for the letter and told her I hoped her therapy was helpful. I didn't forgive her exactly because I wasn't sure I had the right to forgive someone for harm done to others. But I acknowledged her apology and wished her well in her future endeavors, with the caveat that I hoped those endeavors didn't include any more HOA leadership positions. Rachel thought I was too generous. "She doesn't deserve your kindness," she said when I told her about my response. "Maybe not," I agreed, "but I don't want to carry anger about this forever." She faced consequences for her actions. The community moved on. At some point I need to move on too. "You're a better person than I am," Rachel said with a laugh. "I doubt that," I replied. "But I'm trying to be the kind of person I want to be, and that person doesn't hold grudges forever." Life continued. The HOA accountability website kept growing, helping thousands of people navigate conflicts with their homeowners associations. Rachel and I became minor celebrities in the niche world of HOA law, occasionally getting invited to speak at legal conferences or property management seminars. Willow Creek thrived under Margaret Reeves's steady leadership. After 2 years, she stepped down, and a retired engineer named Philip Hart took over as president. The transition was smooth, professional, and conducted with proper elections and procedures. The community had learned from the Patricia Morrison era and was determined not to repeat those mistakes. I kept my garden gnome in place, a small concrete reminder of where it all started. Neighbors would occasionally comment on it, usually with a smile and a knowing look. It had become something of a legend in Willow Creek, the garden gnome that sparked a revolution. On quiet evenings, sitting on my front porch with a beer and watching the Arizona sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and purple, I sometimes thought about how different things could have been. If Patricia had never knocked on my door with her clipboard and her outrage, if she had targeted someone else instead, if I hadn't happened to remember that I owned her rental property, how long would her abuse have continued? The answer was probably indefinitely. She would have kept fining people for imaginary violations, kept using HOA funds for her personal benefit, kept making everyone's lives miserable until either the community imploded or someone else finally challenged her. But that's not what happened. I had challenged her. The community had supported that challenge, and justice had prevailed. It was a small victory in the grand scheme of things, just one abusive HOA president removed from one small community in Phoenix, Arizona. But for the people who lived in Willow Creek, it wasn't small at all. It was the difference between dreading coming home and enjoying their neighborhood. It was the difference between walking on eggshells and feeling free to live their lives. It was the difference between tyranny and community. And sometimes, that's all that matters. The small victories, the local triumphs, the individual stands against injustice that might not make national news but change everything for the people directly affected. I never set out to be an HOA activist or a community champion. I just wanted to defend my garden gnome and challenge an unjust citation. But one thing led to another, and suddenly, I found myself at the center of a movement to hold HOA boards accountable for their actions. Looking back, I wouldn't change a thing. Well, maybe I would have started drinking better coffee earlier in the process, but other than that, no regrets. Patricia Morrison knocked on my door that morning expecting to intimidate another helpless resident, to add another fine to her collection, to exercise the petty power she had accumulated as HOA president. What she didn't know was that she had chosen the wrong target, that I was actually her landlord, and that I remembered everything clearly, every late rent payment, every frivolous complaint, every abuse of authority. I remembered it all, and that made all the difference. The garden gnome still sits beside my front steps, a silent sentinel watching over a community that learned to stand up for itself. Every time I see it, I smile and remember that sometimes the smallest things can spark the biggest changes. Sometimes all it takes is one person refusing to back down, one voice saying this isn't right, one stand against tyranny, no matter how small the tyrant's kingdom might be. And sometimes justice isn't just an abstract concept. Sometimes it's as concrete as a garden gnome and as satisfying as watching a bully finally face the consequences of their actions.